Hi, welcome to Fred Dinenage's Murder Casebook Reopened. I'm Hayley Rhodes and I'm here with Fred.
And I'm delighted to be here.
Nice to have you. We are talking today about a case that I had never heard of, which is remarkable considering how many people this guy killed. It's the case of Archibald Hall.
Archibald Hall was a con man and a serial killer that would stop at nothing to get the luxurious lifestyle he desired.
This is just an animal. He can't be human to do these things.
He was from Glasgow. What do we know about him?
Archibald Hall, the monster butler he was called, a really scary individual because he was totally without pity, without compassion. He killed 5 people, not really for great gain in the end. That was the extraordinary thing about it. And he had absolutely no regrets at all. He never once expressed regret. He was a real cold-hearted serial killer. The irony is, I think I may have met Archibald Hall without realising that I'd met him, because I didn't realise until we made the Murder Casebook programme all those years ago that he died in Kingston Prison in Portsmouth in September 2002 at the age of 78. At the time, he was the oldest prisoner in a British jail then. And towards the late 90s, I made a film inside Kingston Prison in Portsmouth, so I might well have seen Archibald Hall then. I also refereed a charity football match inside the prison, a match between a television team and a team of prisoners, a team of inmates from the prison. So I may well have come across Archibald Hall without even realising it. But yes, you're right, he was born in Glasgow, had a fairly uneventful sort of childhood, but began to get into bad company when he was a young boy, really. And by the age of 15, was stealing regularly, was thieving regularly, and got caught, got apprehended by the law. Eventually moved down to London, which a city that suited his kind of bisexual instincts more easily. And in London, he was caught trying to sell stuff that he'd stolen, jewellery that he'd stolen, silver that he'd stolen in Glasgow. He was caught, he was apprehended, he was sent to prison. In fact, he served several sentences in prison in London while he was down there, even got married in that time and got divorced. But he wasn't stupid, because while he was in prison, he applied himself well. He started studying the aristocracy, he started studying etiquette, because he had this, and he also did elocution as well, because he had this broad Glaswegian accent, and he thought, I've got to get rid of that, I've got to soften it and sound posher, which is what he did. And when he came out of prison for the last time in London, he moved up to Scotland and got himself a job as a butler to a lady called Lady Peggy Hudson, who lived in a rather grand house in Dumfriesshire. And Archibald Hall's plan at the time was, I'm going to rob this lady of her jewellery and her silver and flog it. And if she gets in the way, I'll deal with her. Where it sort of went wrong, or right if you care, he actually became very fond of Lady Hudson and decided he wouldn't go ahead with his plans. He was happy to be a butler on a fairly low salary, strangely enough, and he was happy in his life. Until she employed a man called David Wright, whom Archibald Hall had met in prison, another ex-con, and she employed him as a gamekeeper. That was fine until Wright started to do what Archibald Hall originally intended, which was to steal from Lady Hudson, to steal jewellery and silver. Archibald Hall remonstrated with him and said, no, you mustn't do this. Wright said, look, I'm going to do what I want to do, and if you're not happy with it, I'm going to tell Lady Hudson all about your criminal past, and that'll get you the sack. That gave an idea to Archibald Hall. He'd got to get rid of David Wright, and he did it in a very devious way. He suggested to him that they go out rabbit shooting. So the pair of them went into the wilds of Dumfriesshire to shoot some rabbits. Where Hall was clever was he made sure that David Wright had used up all of the bullets in his gun, and when he'd done that, Archibald Hall simply shot David Wright and killed him.
He lifted his .22 and pointed it at a rabbit and gradually swung it round and shot right in the head. And he shot him not once, but he shot him 4 times. 1 in the head, and then 3 more in his torso.
And that was the first of his victims. It didn't really work out for him because by this time Lady Hudson had become a little bit suspicious of the pair of them, if you like, did a bit of digging and discovered that Archibald Hall did have a criminal record, and so she fired him. But nonetheless, that was the first of his victims. And Lady Hudson had a very lucky escape, I think.
Yeah, if later events were anything to go by. So what's really interesting about Archibald Hall is that a lot of what people think they know about his life and his story and his motivations actually came from 2 autobiographies he wrote himself in prison. And so then I think that the job of people who are interested in him is going back over and unpicking that and trying to work out the truth from the fantasy, because he does seem to have been a fantasist. And one of the people you interviewed for the programme was an author called Alan Nicol and a lawyer. And he'd written a book that sort of sets out to almost debunk some of the things that Archibald Hall wrote about himself. So one of the things about Archibald Hall is that he seems to have been a fantasist who almost he had these aspirations to this kind of Hollywood glamour, which had started when he was a child during the Second World War, watching these very glamorous Hollywood films. And he wanted to set himself up as almost like a gentleman. And as you said, he studied etiquette and elocution and developed this very kind of Anglo-Scottish kind of upper-class accent. And he began to call himself Roy Fontaine.
Yes, he did. Roy Fontaine he felt was a better, more glamorous name than Archibald Hall. And he got the name from an actress called Joan Fontaine, who was extremely popular at the time. And he thought that was a nice, sophisticated sort of name. And after he'd left the employment of Lady Hudson, went back down south again and got himself a job in London with a couple called Dorothy and Walter Scott Elliott. He'd been a Labour MP. They were a very wealthy couple. He got himself a job with them as a butler and proceeded then to do what he was going to do with Lady Hudson, which was rob them of their silver and their jewellery, and that's what he set about doing. But of course, that all went rather dramatically wrong, because they also, in their employment, had a man called Michael Kitto, again a man with a criminal record, and he and Hall, between them, plotted to rob the Scott Elliots of jewellery and of silver, and that's what they did.
So by this point, it's 1977. He's in his 50s by this time, and during his early life, he's committed a lot of petty crimes, and he's spent an awful lot of time in and out of prison, but also psychiatric institutions, because I think on at least 2 occasions he was certified as being in some way insane. He definitely had, I think a psychologist actually would have a field day if they looked at his patterns of behaviour. But he has waited till he's in his 50s to actually commit his first murder, which was of his friend David Wright.
Yes.
And then we're coming up to just a couple of months later, and he's approaching what's going to be his second murder.
Yes, the Scott Elliots. Well, it was Mrs. Scott Elliott who was the first victim, and it was all very unfortunate because Archibald Hall and Michael Kitto had been drinking. They'd been drinking the Scott Elliots wine, and also, I think, plotting further crimes against the Scott Elliots. She overheard them talking, and that sealed her fate. In actual fact, they killed her. And they didn't kill her husband. They chloroformed him and took him to Scotland in the back of a car, in the boot of a car, and that's a few days later, that's where they murdered him as well.
So during this time, he's not suspected of committing any violent crimes. There was no violent crimes really on his record, although he did have firearms offences. And for the programme, you interviewed Professor David Wilson, a criminologist, and he actually did an experiment with you to sort of see how con men work and how he could have come across as so plausible and how no one's suspecting him of these absolutely heinous things.
Con artists rely on their powers of persuasion, their charm, their ability to seduce you, and their confidence to carry the con off.
So what was the experiment that David Wilson did with you?
This was really quite interesting, because my question to David Wilson was, why didn't people suspect Archibald Hall? Why didn't they see through him? And Professor David Wilson says it's very difficult because if people look the part and say, I am so-and-so, I do so-and-so, you tend to believe them because that's human nature. You give the benefit of the doubt to them. So what he did was he'd got 5 different people and said to me, one of these people, one of these 5, is a self-made multi-millionaire. You can talk to each of them very briefly and then decide which one of them is telling the truth. And there were 5 of them, as I say. And the one I picked was a gentleman called VJ, who said he'd made his fortune from cooking curries and selling them.
From a family recipe.
From a family recipe.
And why did you go for VJ?
Because to be honest, he looked the part. He really did look as though he could be a sort of multi-millionaire.
He had a kind of self-assurance, didn't he, that really came across?
Why have you chosen VJ?
VJ just seemed to me to live the part. He felt to me the real thing. There was a confidence about him. There was a sort of knowledgeable thing about him. To me, he just fitted the bill.
So when I say multi-millionaire, do you mind gender? Is it going to be a man as opposed to a woman? Is it going to be somebody who's Afro-Caribbean or Asian, or as opposed to somebody who's white, somebody who's middle-aged, or somebody who's young?
Yes. No, I mean, it could literally be any one of these 5.
But you're still sticking with VJ?
I'm sticking with my man. Fool me completely, because it wasn't him at all.
Yeah.
It was the youngest of the 5, a young chap called Fraser, who eventually I did get, to be fair, at the second attempt. And Fraser, how he'd made his money was his grandmother had given him recipes for jam making, for various sorts of jams. And he started making and producing these and had become incredibly successful, and to this day is still very successful.
Oh, really?
And is selling loads of jam, apparently, in Japan and places like that. Yes. So, and he was the one. But I thought, no, he can't be him because he's too young.
He looked like an intern. He looked like a work experience kid.
He did. So I picked the wrong one. And that's exactly how Archibald Hall, the monster butler, got away with it, because he spoke nicely, he looked rather nice, he spoke softly, but in fact he was a killer.
And actually, as David Wilson said, back then in the 50s, 60s, 70s, societal roles were much more defined, and your expectations of people according to class were much more predictable, I suppose. The kind of the social mobility and the kind of fluidity of kind of the way people behave in different classes didn't exist in the way that it does now, I don't think.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. And Archibald Hall got away with it. He convinced these very wealthy people that he was a butler and a really decent sort of bloke. And of course he wasn't. He was a cold-hearted killer, serial killer.
So having killed poor Dorothy Scott Elliott, he's now in Scotland with his accomplice, Michael Kitto. He's got Walter Scott Elliott, this elderly man, drugged in the car with them. But he's got another person, Mary Coggles, which is a former lover of his, I believe. Or in his words, everyone's a former lover of his.
Yeah.
He's got this Mary Coggles, who is then posing as Dorothy Scott Elliott to withdraw money from banks.
Yeah, and this is where that was her undoing, Mary Coggles, because she insisted on dressing up in the victim's clothes,
Yes,
fur coats, mink coats, exactly, and wearing all the jewellery. And Archibald Hall thought, and Michael Kitto thought, this is dangerous. You know, they're going to pubs with this lady dressed in a mink coat, and they thought, this is crazy. People are going to be suspicious.
Yes, because from what I think that the few words we said about Mary Coggles in the programme is that she didn't necessarily have the personal demeanour or accent to kind of carry off this kind of luxurious look. She sounds like she was a bit of a girl about town.
So Hall and Kitto decided that Mary Coggles was going to be their undoing. So they did what Archibald Hall tended to do. He killed her. He murdered her in cold blood. Absolutely. And of course, yet another victim.
And actually, the words "in cold blood" you've used a couple of times now, and it does seem. I mean, one of the people you interviewed for the programme was Len Murray, who's a solicitor who later represented Hall. And one of the things he says several times is that he was absolutely cold. He had no remorse. Most of these murders weren't actually strictly necessary for him to continue doing what he did, but he just seemed to have I don't know if he enjoyed the killing, but he decided to kill someone and he did it. and that was just what happened.
It was an everyday occurrence as far as Archibald Hall was concerned. Oh, that person's in the way, that person's going to be my undoing. Kill him. Didn't have a second thought about it.
Hall again claims that he was going to kill Mary Coggle quite quickly, and then eventually he's going to take a poker to her head. Kitto comes from behind her and holds her, and then they put a plastic bag over her head so as to suffocate her.
Yeah, and chucked into a little stream.
Yes.
In the middle of nowhere.
Yeah, and this was in December. There was snow on the ground, and they just dumped the poor woman. And then the next move is one that baffles me a little bit. They made contact with Hall's younger brother, Donald, who was a convicted paedophile and also a crook. And they went with him because they were planning some kind of heist.
They were, and they went to Donald's home in Cumbria, and they had a couple of days of eating and drinking. And Donald kept saying to them, I mean, Archibald Hall actually hated his brother, who was allegedly a paedophile. But Donald kept saying, look, I know you're up to no good. I know what you lot are doing. I want to be part of all this. And Archibald Hall thought, no, I don't want him. And again, I think he was kind of threatening, saying, look, I'm going to be part of all this. Otherwise, I'm going to tell the police about you see. And Donald made a big mistake. Donald said, look, I can show you a very clever trick here. I can show you how using a small amount of string or rope, you can make someone completely incapable of movement. And you simply tie their hands behind their back and tie the thumbs together, lie them on their tummy, bend the feet up as well, stick that inside the string or the rope, and they can't move.
Oh my goodness.
So Donald said, let me show you how to do it. And they said, yeah, great, okay. So they tied Donald up so he couldn't move. He was chloroformed, he was killed, he was out the way. And that was victim number 5.
And so victim number 5 actually would ultimately be the undoing and the stopping of this spree, which in 6 months they'd taken the lives of 5 different people. Yeah. But this would be the one that they actually got caught for.
This was extraordinary. They drove Donald. He was in the boot of the car all the way back up to Scotland from Cumbria. He's in the boot of the car. The car originally, on its number plate, has 3 9s. Archibald Hall thought, that's a bit unlucky. I don't fancy the 999, the police call. I'm going to change that. So he interfered with the number plate and got rid of the 3 9s, which actually was their undoing. They checked into a hotel in Scotland with his paedophile brother dead in the boot. They checked in. The hotel manager was suspicious of these two. For some reason, he was suspicious of them. He thought they were up to no good. I don't know why, but I mean, he spotted a con, and obviously.
Yes, I think he found Archibald Hall a bit too glib, is what he
very
said.
Glib, yes.
Is that he was almost a bit too open. He told this story about how the next day they were both emigrating to Australia together, and he was very chatty and almost just too much.
Yes. So he rang the police. They'd gone to their room or whatever, and he rang the police and said, I've got a couple here, and I'm really suspicious about these two. And the police came round.
Which is remarkable, because
Well,
you need a lot more than that to get the police out today, I think.
It was a different time, it was a different age. And the police came round and suddenly realised that the number plate, which had been changed, didn't match the details in the logbook.
Oh, in the tax disc that used to be displayed in the window.
Correct. Absolutely correct. So that's really started to arouse their suspicions. But even so, they didn't immediately twig something was wrong, but they took them in for questioning and eventually looked in the boot of the car and found the body of Donald, Archibald Hall's brother. And that, of course, was the beginning of the end.
Although Hall tried to make it not the beginning of the end because he escaped from the police station.
He did. He went on the run, but inevitably this time he was going to get caught. And eventually, of course, he was linked to the murders down south as well. And when police went round to that house, the Scott Spencers, and discovered what he'd done.
Yeah, so I think that they were questioning him over Donald's murder, and then they realised that there'd been several other unexplained deaths. So the body of Mary Coggle had been found on Christmas Day in a stream, where she'd been dumped, and you interviewed a guy called Alan Place, who was actually the officer who found her body, and she was found with face injuries and head injuries, and so they were already suspicious of him for that one. They'd obviously made the connection, and then they realised that there was this couple from London who hadn't been seen in some time.
Exactly. So they went down there. Someone had reported that jewellery and silver had been taken from the house, and that led back to Archibald Hall. So they got him on that one as well.
And then at that point, he started gradually leading the police to the bodies that he'd left kind of scattered around the place.
Yes, he did. He took them to all of the where the bodies had been left or buried, and was quite open about the whole thing. You were there when Wright's body was found.
Yes, well, I can always remember it was a terribly cold, it had been a long cold spell, and it was a right snowy day, and we were showing where the body was, and a whole team of us, and of course the Chief Constable was there. We went to the place which had been described and shown to us indeed by Hall, and we excavated the body off Wright, which was quite something as he'd been buried for a wee while. And he was then taken back, obviously, to the mortuary.
He was in a bit of a state.
It was a bit of a state, aye. Not a pleasant job. We carried him actually on an old door. We didn't have a stretcher, so he was rolled onto an old door that we found on the Kirtleton estate, and he was carried unceremoniously back to Kirtleton, where he was put in the back of a recovery vehicle.
You know, and he'd actually gained very little from all of this series of killings.
Not at all. No. He hadn't enriched himself, and it doesn't even feel like a lot of the time that was really, there wasn't much of a master plan to become rich off of it.
No, it was, the whole thing was very hit and miss, mainly hit as it turned out.
So 1978, Michael Kitto and Archibald Hall are brought to trial, first of all, for the murders of David Wright and Walter Scott Elliott.
In Scotland?
Yeah, in Scotland. And the outcome of that is that they're both found guilty of those murders. Michael Kitto gets 15 years, but Archibald Hall gets 2 life sentences.
Correct. And then they're tried in England for the crimes there.
So that's for Mary Coggle's murder, but also for Donald Hall, so Archibald's younger brother.
Correct.
And so again, it's 2 more life sentences for Archibald Hall at that point in time. So he's got 4 life sentences. The murder of Dorothy Scott Elliott is something that they're both accused of, but that's left to lie on file. So I wonder whether there just wasn't enough evidence to
I think there was confusion whether it was Archibald Hall or Kitto who actually struck the blow that killed the poor lady. I think there was no certainty about that at all, so that one's laid on file. Kitto, of course, since all this has happened, Kitto was released, but no one knows whatever happened to him, but Archibald Hall wasn't.
So at some point, Archibald Hall's sentence appears to have been commuted to a whole life tariff, so he was never going to be released, and he did live a very long time in prison.
Yes, he did. He was moved to various prisons during his sentence, but he eventually finished up at Kingston Prison in Portsmouth, where in September 2002 he died an unhappy man, but still reliving these fantasies about himself. He died at the age of 78, the oldest prisoner in Britain at that time, of a stroke. A sad ending for a sad man.
I'd like to have met him. I think that it would be so interesting to meet someone with that level of narcissism and that level of delusion about who they should be.
Totally untrustworthy man. I mean, it was even said that his accomplice who went down with him, Michael Kitto, it was even said that Archibald Hall was plotting to kill him as well. And I wouldn't be at all surprised, because anybody who Hall perceived to be getting in his way or knowing too much about him was going to be killed.
He was a very dangerous man to know.
Absolutely.
He put his time in there to, I don't know whether you would call it good use, but he wrote 2 autobiographies during his time in prison. But from people in your programme who spoke about the real facts of the cases, these really were works of fantasy. They were written in the style of almost these Hollywood adventure stories. And one of the things he focuses on a lot is his own sexual magnetism.
Yeah, I mean, I think he was a complete fantasist, because he kind of inferred he'd more or less had sexual relations with most of the people involved in his story, you know, including Mary Coggle and some of the men involved as
Yeah,
well.
so he said he met David Wright in Long Lartin and they had a sexual relationship. He said that when he was working for Lady Peggy Hudson, she was interviewed at one point by a journalist called Frank Ryan, who told you that she'd made no mention of their sexual relationship. So again, I think...
A much older lady as well.
Yes, I think it was he had this kind of enduring idea that everybody he met was sexually drawn to him.
Yeah.
And I think, that speaks to his narcissism.
Well, he saw himself as a David Niven type character. He'd seen David Niven in Hollywood films, etc. The romantic sort of lead. And Archibald Hall saw himself in that sort of role. He was a complete cold-hearted fantasist.
Hall really did think of himself as a cut above the rest, as somebody who was sexually dynamic, sexually magnetic to both genders. Hall lived a fantasy life, but the tragedy is, of course, that Hall ultimately also had some deep-seated psychopathy. Hall is somebody who's going to seduce people so as to take things from them, and sometimes that involved taking their lives. This is not a nice man.
All sorts of odd things came out of the filming of that particular programme on The Monster Butler. I'll always remember we were filming in a remote part of Dumfriesshire, and I was doing a piece to camera talking about Archibald Hall and serial killers. And we were being watched by a group of young lads with their bikes who were quite close, about half a dozen of them. And I just finished when one of them said to me, "Excuse me, can I ask you a question?" I said, "Yes, what is it?" He said, "Are you a serial killer?" I said, "No." And he said, "What are you then?" I said, "Well, I'm a television presenter." "Oh," he said, "do you know anybody famous?" And I said, "Yes." And just for a joke, I said, "Yes, I know Fred Dinenage." "Oh," he said, "I've never heard of him. Is he a serial killer?" Collapse of Stout Party. So a bit of humour in a very, very grim story.
Thanks for joining us again, Fred, and we'll look forward to the next one.
Thank you very much. See you soon.